Good morning again. Welcome, everyone. Special welcome if you're watching online or on demand at a later point in time. We are moving through a series that we've called Disconnected, and we're talking about some of the reasons people get disconnected from relationships and from community and from church, but also ways in which we can get reconnected. And why that's so important in our lives, particularly at this juncture in history. We absolutely need each other. So this morning, we're going to be talking about something called identity and how we identify ourselves. So funny story about me. Some of you know I grew up down in Los Angeles, so I'm a SoCal boy originally, although very happy to be in Santa Cruz now. But interestingly enough, growing up, I really wasn't that excited about being in California. I didn't like the fact that it was warm in the winter and we didn't get snow. And I hated the fact that, especially where, we have great summers here in Santa Cruz, but where I grew up, it was like normal to have like weeks at a time over 100 degrees. Hated that. And I wanted to see green, not the just, brown that we saw on the hills around us, all except for like 2 weeks in March when we got rain, right? So as I grew up and Katie and I got married, we ended up going off to seminary in Chicago, and then later on we lived in the Pacific Northwest, and all of a sudden we realized, California is not that bad compared to having to deal with a blizzard or having 9 months of gray in the Pacific Northwest. So we're like, California is all right. And it turns out the hills aren't brown, they're golden, which is amazing. But also, one of the interesting things that happened, particularly when we were in Chicago, I never considered myself like a particularly cool person. Like my style and fashion sense was always just kind of mid. But we went to Chicago, and all of a sudden, everything that like Katie and I were wearing was like 5 years ahead of the trends. So we were like cutting edge. We were super cool. People wanted to be like us. We're like, what is happening? This is so weird. And so like California became like our identity. Like we left California and all of a sudden we became like California's biggest fans. We're wearing California t-shirts and talking about California and drinking California beer and like, all the things. It was great. So since we've lived back here and we don't plan on leaving California again, hopefully we've mellowed out a little bit. And so that's obviously kind of silly. The fact that we chose to identify ourselves so much with where we're from. But answering the question, who are you, can be really challenging. How would you answer that question this morning? Who are you? This might even be a harder question to answer than the dreaded interview question. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Right? It's like, who knows how to answer that question? You could go off in a million different directions, but identity, who we are, how do you sum that up? What direction do you go in? Right? You can identify yourselves with sports teams or hobbies. I can tell you that I'm a Dodger fan and a Laker fan and a Niners fan. So I got at least one Bay Area team in there, so don't stone me for being a Dodgers fan afterwards. Right? Or hobbies. I'm a cyclist. I love cycling, or I love reading, or I love collecting books. Shocker, right? We can identify ourselves with these things. And those are kind of silly. No one, at least most people, wouldn't say that's my ultimate identity. Although in the middle of the fall, when it's football season, you might wonder about some of the males in your life, right? But we can also end up identifying ourselves with things like ideologies and philosophies and political parties and movements. Think about just how polarized and divided our nation is right now, just over politics. It's because politics has ceased to be just this thing that we happen to do together to figure out what our common life looks like, and all of a sudden it's like life or death stakes. And I'm not saying that politics isn't important and that there isn't high stakes in it, but when we see each other as the absolute enemy, and if the other person wins, that means the end of our identity, then we can't live together anymore. It's because we've elevated something that was never supposed to be our identity, all of who we are, to the most important thing. But then sometimes we can even become identified by our families or our race or our gender or our sexuality, right? The most important thing can end up becoming the fact that my family is Jewish and all of the implications of that down through my family's history and how they've had to flee persecution over time. Or race, right? You get typed by your race and all of a sudden that becomes the most important thing about you, for better or for worse. Or sexuality, which is always such a big thing in our culture right now. The good news, though, this morning, right, is that none of these identities that we make for ourselves or the identities that are pressed onto us can ultimately define us. None of those things can ultimately define who we are. Because of Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection, our identities, who we are, is now caught up in God himself. So who are you this morning? You're someone God loves. You are God's beloved. Now, there's many of you out there, I know, who have probably heard this your whole lives. But you're struggling to experience it. It's something that you know in your head, but it hasn't dropped down into your heart, right? It's not a part of our daily lived experience. And so what I hope we can see this morning is that living into this new identity isn't something that just sort of magically happens. Like poof, one day you wake up and it's like the lights turn on and there's birds chirping and rainbows outside and I have a halo and I just go through life and now I know I'm a child of God. No. God has given us concrete practices for us to experience and then reflect back on, and these help our identities as God's beloved to become something that we don't just know in our heads, but it becomes something that we know deep down in our bones. That's what we want. And so the practice we're going to look at this morning is the practice of baptism. So we have some folks getting baptized earlier. We heard from Jim about how his daughter is getting baptized. So it's baptism morning here at Santa Cruz Bible, and we didn't even plan it that way. It's awesome. We're going to see that in baptism, Jesus offers us a new and secure identity, one that's unshakable and one that's going to transform us and our communities. So let's dive in. We're going to begin by looking at a passage from Paul's letter to the churches in Galatia, the book of Galatians, chapter 3, verses 26 to 29. So just to set this up, Paul is writing this letter to a group of churches in what is now called Turkey. Ancient Galatia is now in the country of Turkey. And these were churches that had come to faith in Jesus, and yet because of some of the conflicts that were happening in the early church, they came to believe, or many of people in those churches came to believe, that in order to be identified with Jesus, in order to be a faithful Christian, you had to keep perfectly what they called the works of the law. And so they looked back to the Hebrew scriptures and the laws and the regulations that God had given to his people Israel. And these people who had come to faith in Jesus said, we have to do all of these things now in order to be identified with God and his people and his purposes in the world. And Paul writes this letter to say, no, now that Jesus comes into the world, all of those practices and things you do, they may be good, they may be bad, but those aren't the things that define you anymore. The only thing that defines us is Jesus and his faithfulness for us. So that's where we pick up the story. So read along with me, Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 through 29. It says, "For you all are children of God through faith in the Messiah, Jesus. You see, every one of you has been baptized every one of you who has been baptized into the Messiah has put on the Messiah. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no male or female. You are all one in the Messiah Jesus. So what's going on here? The Apostle Paul is talking about how when we come to faith in Jesus, we receive a new identity. And so when Paul talks about putting on the Messiah or putting on Jesus, this is identity language, right? If I put on a shirt and some jeans and a pair of Vans, what do I look like? I look like I'm wearing a button-up shirt and jeans and a pair of Vans. If I put on a three-piece suit, what do I look like? I look like a banker or something, right? Or look, I'm going to a Hollywood premiere. If I put on Jesus, what do I look like? I look like Jesus. That becomes my identity. And so we become identified with Jesus himself so that everything that is true of Jesus, becomes true of us as well. But the way we do this, the way we experience this, according to Paul, is through baptism. So this brings up the question, what is baptism? Now I'm going to get real basic here for a moment, because if you've been around the church for any length of time, you probably take this for granted. But for those of us that are newer to the church or to the way of Jesus, rites and practices like baptism probably seem pretty strange, right? You might wonder what you got yourself into. But this is just the most basic way to explain it. Baptism is a practice where we submerge someone in a tank of water. There's one right over there. In some Christian churches, they sprinkle people with water. That's okay too. And then we bring them up out of the water. It's that simple. That's what it is. And the reason that we do this is it's a symbolic way that we let other people know that we are identifying with Jesus in his life and in his death, in his resurrection, and in his new life. We are choosing to identify with Jesus. But even more important than our choice to get in that tank and allow someone to submerge us is the gifts that we receive through baptism. Because according to the Christian tradition, baptism is one of the few places in life where we can expect God to show up and trust that he will be there every single time. And the gifts that God offers us when we come to be baptized are the gifts of God's own life and God's own identity. So we choose to identify ourselves with God, but God is giving us the gift of a new identity. So what is this identity, and why would it matter that I identify with Jesus when I'm baptized? Well, I want us to look real quick at a story from the life of Jesus himself. So in each of the Gospels, it talks about how Jesus himself came and was baptized by his cousin John in the Jordan River in modern-day Israel, Palestine. So we're going to pick up this, one of the accounts of this in Mark chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. And it says, "At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. So just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, 'You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased.'" So when Jesus was baptized, the Spirit was present there, and the voice of God the Father comes out of heaven, confirming for Jesus and everyone else that this is God's beloved Son, and he loves him very, very much. When you and I identify with baptism, if everything that is true of Jesus becomes true of us, then our identity becomes beloved by God. And this is important because our lesser identities, everything else that might be good, might be bad, that might give us an advantage or might keep us oppressed, in God's new kingdom, they don't matter anymore. Because we have the identity of Jesus himself, God's beloved Son, along with all of the same rights and privileges. And so this is incredibly good news. It's the best news. It's the greatest gift that we could ever receive. But it's also news and a gift that challenges us. So I want us to take a look at a few ways in which this challenges us, and particularly our way of life today. Listen, the first is that our identity in baptism, or our baptismal identity, try saying that at your next cocktail party. So, our baptismal identity in Jesus challenges our performance. Listen again to what the Apostle Paul says earlier in his letter to the Galatians from the passage that we already read. He says, "But we know that a person is not declared righteous by works of the Jewish law, but through the faithfulness of Jesus, the Messiah." See, there's a narrative that we have all, as Western American people, received and lived in and breathed, that if we just try hard enough, we can construct a place for ourselves in the world. Right? We do this with our jobs. If I can just work hard, if I can just show my boss my worth, I might get a raise, I might get a promotion, right? And then I might have to travel more, and then I might have to work more hours, and I might have to spend more time away from my kids and my spouse and my family. Or how about social media and all of the personal improvement plans that they give us? I mean, you just scroll through TikTok for 5 minutes and you start feeling really bad about yourself because here's, a workout plan, or here's a bedtime routine that's going to change your life, or here's a diet to try, or here's a shutdown routine for work, or all of these things that you are supposed to do in order to have a flourishing, successful life, to prove that you are somebody in the world. And it's not like any of those things are bad. Working hard, having a job is great. Personal improvement is great. But what it misses is that when these identities let us down, and they will always let us down, they will come back, when they let us down, we will come back to the ground of our lives and discover that we are loved. We were loved all along. We were loved before we even put out effort to try hard. We discover that we're accepted, and we have an identity that we never had to earn. This was a lesson I learned painfully about 10 years ago. See, as many of you know, am a nerd for reading the Bible and studying the Bible and theology. I'm one of those really weird people that does that for fun. So, that tells you everything you need to know right there. But in the circles that I grew up in, that was everything. If you read and studied and interpreted the Bible faithfully, according to what they taught at least, and you read at least the right theology books and believed according to that tradition, then you were going to be okay. Then you were going to be successful. Then your ministry was going to be blessed, and you were going to be secure. And sure, some bad things might happen, but you were going to be all right. Well, about 10 years ago, that all came crashing down because I believed all the right things and taught all the right things. And yet, I still experienced what I would call religious trauma, religious abuse in the church. And I experienced a season that felt like failure, where I felt like a failure because all of these things, all of what I was supposed to do, didn't work for me. And it felt awful, not going to lie. It was a terrible season, the worst couple years of my life. But the gift of that season was that all of those things, no matter how good they were, I was able to come down to the ground of my life and realize that I am loved by God, no matter how much theology I know or don't know. I am loved by God, no matter how much I read my Bible or don't read my Bible. No matter what my theology or interpretation is. And so it was this season of stripping away, but it was a stripping away in the best way, to realize that once all of these things I'd constructed my identity around were taken away from me, I realized that I was still a person that was loved. And that was all I needed. Now, I'm still going to read theology because, like I said, I think it's fun. But that's not the most important thing anymore. The most important thing is experiencing deep down in my bones that I am a child of God. So our identity in baptism, our identity in Jesus, challenges our performance, but it also challenges our oppression. See, we oftentimes construct these performance identities, but there's also identities that are forced upon us. Ways in which we're defined that limit our power and our flourishing. I mean, a classic example of this is women in our culture. I mean, you are at least half, if not 3/4 of the people sitting in this room, and yet in our American society, and especially in our church culture, which is very patriarchal, meaning the men get all the positions of power and authority, women are just kind of marginalized. You know, women just stay at home and raise the kids. Women go to the kitchen and make a sandwich. You know, all of that really awful stuff. And in the church, because of a handful of verses that we would say are misinterpreted, women are kept out of positions of power and authority. Women are kept out of positions like standing on this stage, like Don Lindholm is going to do next week, or having positions on our board of directors, our elder board. And so women are marginalized simply because they're women, not because they have done anything right or wrong. Or how about race in the U.S.? We construct this idea that we call whiteness, which, what is whiteness anyway? And then we classify people that don't fit our categories, that we say aren't white, and then we treat them poorly. And you look at the outcomes in our culture of people that aren't considered white, and almost across the board, those outcomes are worse. Their lives are worse. They're not flourishing in the same way. And so, into this comes the kingdom of God. In Galatians 3:28, Paul says this: "There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no male or female. You are all one in Messiah Jesus." So what this means isn't that your identity is part of a marginalized group, as a woman, as a person of color, as a sexual minority, or any of the other things we could think of. It's not that those things don't matter. They do. And they're so important to who you are. And yet in Jesus, you have the identity of the Messiah, Jesus himself. And so in God's kingdom, none of these lesser identities can be used to harm or oppress you anymore, or at least they shouldn't be. The church should be the place where you experience the most freedom in who you are. But sadly, many churches aren't that safe space for those who find themselves marginalized by the world. Instead, the churches reflect the patterns of the world that harm and sideline human beings made in God's own image. And so what our baptismal identity does is it challenges any church that doesn't make their communities a safe space for everyone who is one in Jesus, who is a fully qualified member of the kingdom because of God's love for them. I had a really beautiful example of the way this ought to look when I started my Doctor of Ministry program at Western Theological Seminary back in Michigan. We were back there for the start of my program, and we had our first chapel, and the president of the seminary, who at the time was this older white pastor, and he got up, and to the whole room of us assembled, new master's students, new doctoral students, he got up and said, specifically to the women in the room, he said, "I want you to know that you belong here. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you do not belong here. And let me tell you, yeah, that's worth celebrating. There was not a dry eye in the room. And listening to so many of these women and the ways that these handful of verses misinterpreted were used to oppress them, used to tell them that the gifts and the calling of God that they felt on their lives were really just, it was their imagination, or really it was, they were just supposed to go teach Sunday school for the rest of their lives. Or, not that Sunday school is bad, but to limit people to that is ridiculous. So the church ought to be this safe space. Finally, not only does our identity in Jesus challenge our performance and our oppression, it also challenges what I'm calling our individualism. It challenges our sense that I can go it alone in life. Listen to how Paul puts it in Galatians 3:29. He says, "If you belong to the Messiah, you are Abraham's family. You stand to inherit the promise." Our identity in Jesus, it reminds us that we're not alone. Because when we're baptized, it's not like God gives us a gold star and says, "Great job," and then sends us on our way to figure it out. Like, okay, what do I do now? No, God saves us into a family that we call the church. And the church is this inheritor of all these incredible promises that God made to Abraham and to his family throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. And we don't have time to get into all of that this morning, but spend some time looking at the promises of God to his people in the Hebrew Scriptures, and know that you and I, us together, including Santa Cruz Bible Church, are the recipients of these promises. And the reason is because the way that God always wanted to change the world wasn't through some heroic individuals, right? This isn't Braveheart or big feats of power or strength. The way God has always wanted to change the world was through a community of people who quietly but powerfully live in a way that runs counter to the values of every culture, not just our culture, the values of every culture across time. And so when we gather together, like we're here this morning, when we go outside and have some incredible tri-tip for lunch, when we lean on each other, when we live life together, that is grace. That is God's grace present with us, healing the fabric of our community. And what it's going to do is that's going to have ripple effects through time and space in ways that we could have never imagined. When people encounter us in our life together, they'll be encountering God himself. And that's what Santa Cruz and the world so desperately needs. So a couple challenges as we finish this morning. Talked about ways in which you can experience hurt and oppression in the world and sometimes even in church, unfortunately. If you've been hurt by this community that we call the church, we want to be a safe space where you can find healing. That's something we're passionately committed to as Santa Cruz Bible Church. And so one of the things that we're going to be offering this fall is a course, a class, an experience. Not really sure how to describe it yet because it's not just, we're not going to be teaching at you. But it's on the intersection of faith and trauma. And the reality is that trauma is something that is so pervasive in our lives and in our world. And yet the reality at the same time is that our Christian faith offers so many resources for us to heal and to flourish and to thrive, and then make safe spaces for others to heal and to flourish and to thrive. And that's the kind of community we want to be. And so if that's you, if you want to know how we can be a safe space, or if you're someone that wants to heal from some of this trauma, we invite you to come and experience this journey along with us this fall. That's going to be starting in September, and Jennifer is going to tell you more at the end. For those of you that maybe aren't in that category, but you've been going it alone for a while, maybe not those of you in the room because you all are here, but even those of you watching online at home. I know it's been a challenging few years and things have been crazy since March 2020. But we invite you back into community. And that doesn't need to look like, doing a cannonball back into community and, splashing everywhere. Maybe it could be dipping your toe in, taking some small steps. Maybe showing up for a Wednesday night class or group or women's Bible study that Chrissy's starting up on Thursday mornings in September. Or maybe even joining a community group and experiencing the connection and the community and the growth that happens in a space like that. There's a lot of ways to do it, but we invite you to take that tangible step. Again, when Jennifer comes up to do the announcements, we're going to talk about that a little more. There's some opportunities in the lobby. But we invite you to become that community that Jesus died for, that he paid his life for, so that we can flourish, but maybe even more importantly, so that the community of Santa Cruz can flourish around us. Let's pray. Holy Three, Father, Son, and Spirit, we are so grateful that you have given us new life, a new identity, that we can identify with you, Jesus, in your life and in your death and in your resurrection and in your new life. That whatever our lives have looked like up to this point, if our lives have been marked by trauma and by pain and by suffering and by oppression, in you, Jesus, we can experience hope, we can experience healing, we can experience flourishing. And so my prayer for us is that we would, each of us individually, embody that identity. But maybe even more importantly, that we as your community, Santa Cruz Bible Church, and all the churches across Santa Cruz would be the community that embodies the beauty and the grandeur and the safety and the security and the comfort that comes from belonging to you and embodying your presence to a hurting and broken world, Jesus. So for all these things, again, we recognize that we can't do it. This is much too big for us, but it's not too big for you. And so we trust you for all of it. We love you, Jesus, and we pray these things in your name. Amen.